Have you ever walked into a place where you were supposed to belong only to be treated like you didn't deserve to be there? Imagine standing in a beautiful boutique, excited to find the perfect dress, when suddenly a stranger points at you and accuses you of stealing. No evidence, no reason, just judgment. What would you do if every eye turned toward you, waiting to see if you would crumble under the weight of someone else's prejudice? Would you defend yourself? Would you walk away, or would you stand tall? Knowing the truth was on your side. Now picture this, a 17-year-old girl humiliated in front of strangers, her dignity questioned simply because of the color of her skin. She chooses not to shrink back, but to hold her ground. And when the tension reaches its peak, her father arrives. Not just any father, but a CEO whose very name is on the store's walls. What happens next left everyone in stunned silence. If you were in her place, what choice would you make? And if you were in the crowd, would you stay silent or speak? Stay with us as we unfold this powerful story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that matter. The boutique stood on the corner of Michigan Avenue, polished glass windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Inside, warm lighting spilled across mahogany shelves, and the faint hum of jazz floated through hidden speakers. It was the kind of place where sales associates spoke in soft voices and customers lingered slowly, savoring the quiet exclusivity. Amira Johnson paused before pushing open the door. 17 years old, tall for her age, with a poise that made people guess she was older. Amira carried herself with a confidence that came from within. She brushed a hand over her simple denim jacket, exhaled, and stepped inside. This wasn't her first time in Maison Estelle. The luxury boutique had been part of her father's business empire for years, but it was the first time she had come alone. Normally she tagged along with her father or her aunt, both of whom knew the staff by name. Today was different. Today she wanted to prove something to herself. She wasn't here to flaunt money. She wasn't here to prove anyone wrong. She was here to find a dress for a special evening, the Heritage Foundation Charity Gala. Her father, David Johnson, would be hosting. And for Amira, it was more than just a party. It was her chance to step into a world where she often felt like an outsider, a room full of adults, executives, leaders. She wanted to walk in wearing something that made her feel like she belonged. Her eyes scanned the rows of gowns, silk satin, sequins, each carefully arranged by color. She felt a thrill ripple through her chest. Here she was, making her own choice. But across the room, another pair of eyes narrowed. Margaret Whitmore had been a regular at Maison Estelle for nearly a decade. In her early 50s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair and pearls draped across her neck. She carried herself like the store existed solely for women like her. To Margaret, luxury was not only a lifestyle, but a boundary one that separated the right kind of people from the rest. She noticed Amira the moment the girl walked in. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes cool and dismissive. Margaret's gaze followed Amira's every step, irritation tightening with each passing second. When Amira reached for a dress, Margaret leaned toward a nearby customer and muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "They're letting anyone in these days." The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. The customer beside her shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear, but the damage was done. A few others had caught the remark too. Eyes flicked toward Amira, curious, hesitant, unsure. Amira, lost in the details of a navy blue gown, didn't catch the words. Not yet. She was still in her own bubble, imagining what it might feel like to wear that dress, to stand tall at the gala. At the back of the store, Sophie Clark, the new manager, adjusted her name tag nervously. Only a few weeks into the job, she was still learning the rhythms of the boutique. She noticed the tension forming, but didn't know whether to step in. Maison Estelle had a reputation to uphold, and she feared making the wrong call. Margaret's eyes narrowed further as Amira moved gracefully from rack to rack, her hand brushing fabric with appreciation, not hesitation. It was the confidence that bothered Margaret most. Confidence, she thought, was something that had to be earned. And in her world, Amira didn't look like someone who belonged here, alone. Browsing gowns meant for Chicago's elite. Amira finally paused in front of a long emerald green gown. She lifted it carefully from the hanger, the silk spilling like water. A smile broke across her face. Yes, this was the one. She held it against herself, her reflection glimmering in the mirror. She didn't see Margaret's glare. She didn't notice Sophie's anxious shifting in the corner. All she saw was possibility. But possibility was exactly what Margaret intended to crush. She stepped forward, heels clicking against the polished wood floor, her voice sharp yet coated with a false sweetness. "Lovely dress," she said, the compliment dripping with something colder than disapproval. Amira turned politely. "Thank you," she said, her tone warm, genuine. "I think it might be perfect for my father's event." Margaret's smile thinned. She leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to seem intimate, but loud enough for nearby ears. "Are you sure you're in the right store?" For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Amira blinked, not fully grasping the question. Her brows furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I'm exactly where I need to be." She turned back toward the mirror, smoothing the gown against her body, determined not to let a stranger's words define her moment. But the stranger wasn't finished. Margaret's eyes burned, her lips curling as if tasting bitterness. She murmured again, this time without pretense. "This store isn't exactly budget-friendly. Maybe you should try somewhere more affordable." The sting hit Amira like a sudden draft of cold air. She felt her stomach tighten, but she refused to let the words pierce deeper than they deserved. Her chin lifted, and she said quietly but firmly, "I'll let my choices speak for themselves." The room seemed to exhale. Customers who had been pretending to browse now glanced up, curiosity mixing with unease. Sophie fidgeted again, hands clasping the edge of her clipboard. Margaret tilted her head, eyes narrowing even further. She wasn't satisfied. She wanted more. And though Amira didn't yet know it, this was only the beginning. The emerald green gown swayed gently on its hanger as Amira returned it to the rack. She wasn't ready to try it on yet. She wanted to wander, to take in the whole store, to give herself space before stepping into the fitting room, but she could feel it now, the weight of eyes on her. A prickle ran across the back of her neck, the unmistakable awareness that she was being watched. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the smooth texture of a sequined dress, the shimmer of champagne silk under the boutique lights. Shopping here had always felt like a quiet joy, a chance to admire craftsmanship, but now there was a subtle shift in the air, something brittle that followed her every movement. Margaret Whitmore trailed a few steps behind, her heels tapping in an impatient rhythm. She didn't bother hiding her stare anymore. Her arms were crossed, her lips pursed, her gaze sharp as a hawk circling prey. Each time Amira picked up a dress, Margaret leaned in close enough to mutter under her breath, words not meant for Amira alone but for everyone within earshot. "I wonder if she's even planning to buy anything. They really don't screen customers like they used to." A couple browsing nearby shifted uncomfortably. The man tugged at his wife's sleeve, whispering, "Don't get involved." The wife nodded, lowering her eyes. Silence felt safer than confrontation. Amira heard one of the remarks this time, Her spine stiffened, but she chose not to react. She had been raised on the principle that dignity was something you carried within you, not something anyone else could take away. Still, her pulse quickened. Each step felt heavier, each glance around the boutique more loaded with judgment. At the front counter, Sophie Clark watched the tension mount. She fiddled with her pen, debating whether to approach. She could sense trouble brewing, but she was still so new here, barely a month into managing Maison Estelle. Margaret was a regular, a customer known by name, while Amira was at least to Sophie an unfamiliar face. The calculus felt simple, and yet something gnawed at her conscience. Margaret, emboldened by the silence of others, followed Amira toward the fitting rooms. She stood close enough to cast a shadow as Amira held the emerald gown in front of her once more. "You know," Margaret said sweetly, "that dress is lovely, but it's one of the more expensive pieces. Maybe you should check the clearance rack in the back." Amira's lips parted slightly in surprise. The cruelty in the woman's voice was wrapped so tightly in false kindness that it almost passed as advice. Almost. She steadied herself, meeting Margaret's gaze head-on. "I came here to shop," she said simply. "Same as you." Margaret tilted her head. "Did you?" Amira's jaw tightened, but she refused to rise to the bait. She turned toward the fitting room. Emerald silk draped over her arm. "Behind her," Margaret muttered once again, but louder this time, ensuring the customers nearby would hear bet she's not even here to buy anything, just trying things on for fun. The words struck harder than the others. They weren't just aimed at Amira's wallet. They questioned her right to exist in this space, to take up room in a boutique where Margaret believed only her kind belonged. Amira closed the fitting room door gently, her hands trembling slightly. She sat down on the small velvet bench, the gown folded carefully across her lap. For a moment, she let herself breathe. In, out. She thought of her father, of his lessons about resilience. "You don't have to shout to stand tall," he had told her once, "but don't ever shrink to make someone else comfortable." She stood, shaking out the nerves, and slipped into the gown. The fabric hugged her frame, the color deepening the glow of her skin. When she stepped out into the boutique, heads turned, not because she was out of place, but because she looked radiant. Margaret's eyes narrowed further. The sight of Amira glowing in a dress meant for elegance and power struck her like an insult. She plastered on a smile and stepped closer, her tone dripping with saccharine mockery. "Beautiful dress," she said. "Almost looks like it belongs." Amira glanced at her in the mirror, refusing to flinch. "It does," she answered quietly. A ripple moved through the crowd of customers. Whispers spread, the tension thickening like fog. Sophie cleared her throat from across the room, forcing a polite smile as she approached. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her voice too high, too cautious. Margaret seized the opening. She gestured toward Amira with a dramatic wave of her hand. "I've been watching her. She's acting suspicious. You might want to keep an eye on your merchandise." The words struck Amira like a slap. Her stomach knotted, but she steadied herself. "Excuse me," she said, turning to face Margaret fully. Margaret's lips curved into a thin smile. "Well, it just seems odd, that's all. Taking dresses back and forth, lingering. You know how it looks." Amira's cheeks flushed, not from guilt, but from fury contained behind composure. She looked at Sophie, the manager, who suddenly seemed very interested in her clipboard. For a moment, the entire boutique felt suspended in silence. The jazz music still played softly in the background, but it felt far away, drowned by the thudding of Amira's heartbeat. She wanted to scream. She wanted to disappear. But instead, she stood taller, adjusting the strap of the gown and facing the mirror again. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "I'm here to buy a dress. That's all." No one applauded. No one intervened. The other customers simply looked down at their phones or at the racks of clothing as if by ignoring what was happening they could erase their own discomfort. Margaret smirked, victorious in her own mind. For her, the game had just begun, and Amira, caught in the center of the boutique's uneasy quiet, realized that her afternoon was no longer about finding a dress. It was about something larger, something heavier, something she could not yet name, but felt deep in her bones. The hostility wasn't just quiet anymore. It was loud enough for everyone to hear, and yet no one spoke. The silence that followed Margaret's insinuations seemed to stretch across the boutique like a curtain. Amira stood before the mirror in the emerald green gown, her chin lifted, her eyes locked on her reflection. She refused to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Still, the sting of the woman's words cut deep. She reminded herself to breathe, to hold on to her composure as if it were armor. Margaret lingered close by, arms folded tightly, her pearls catching the soft light. Her smirk deepened each time Amira shifted in the gown. It wasn't enough for Margaret to cast doubt. She wanted to puncture the confidence that radiated from this young woman who dared to stand tall in her presence. "Pretty," Margaret said finally, her tone dripping with condescension. "But are you sure you're ready for that kind of look? Sometimes a dress can overwhelm a girl if she doesn't quite fit the part." The remark landed like a dart. Customers who had been pretending to browse stiffened, their eyes darting back and forth. Amira's hands trembled slightly against the silky fabric, but she steadied herself and turned her gaze toward Margaret. "I don't believe clothes decide who belongs in them," Amira said evenly. "People do." A faint gasp echoed from the corner, a young woman clutching a handbag pausing mid-step. Sophie, the manager, stood a few paces away, twisting the cap of her pen nervously. She wanted to say something, to step in, but the fear of upsetting a wealthy regular like Margaret kept her glued in place. Margaret's lips curled. "Well," she said with mock sweetness, "people also need to live within their means." Amira inhaled slowly. She felt anger rise in her chest, hot and sharp, but she remembered her father's voice echoing in her memory. "You don't need to shout. Your calm will say more than their rage ever could." So she straightened her shoulders, met Margaret's eyes, and replied, "I'll let my choices speak for themselves." The boutique seemed to tighten with anticipation. A man browsing ties pretended to adjust his cufflinks, but stayed close enough to listen. Two college-aged women whispered near the perfume counter, one of them raising her phone as if debating whether to start recording. Margaret didn't like losing ground. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned closer, her voice pitched higher so others could hear. Some people forget that just because they can walk through the door doesn't mean they belong here. This time, Amira heard every word. She turned fully toward Margaret, emerald silk shimmering under the lights. Her face remained calm, but her voice carried a firmness that cut through the boutique. "I belong here as much as anyone else," she said. The room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret blinked, clearly startled by Amira's refusal to back down. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. Sophie stepped forward cautiously. "Ladies, perhaps we can," she began, but Margaret cut her off. "I've been shopping here for years," Margaret announced, her voice rising. "I know what this store represents, and I know trouble when I see it." She turned deliberately toward the nearby customers, her hand gesturing toward Amira as though presenting evidence. You've all seen how she's been lingering, carrying things around. Suspicious, isn't it? The murmur of voices stirred again. A man coughed nervously. A woman shook her head but said nothing. The silence of complicity filled the space more loudly than any accusation. Amira's cheeks flushed. She wanted desperately to retreat, to escape the humiliation that pressed on her from all sides. But another part of her, the part her father had nurtured, refused to give in. She stood taller, her gaze sweeping the boutique. "I've done nothing wrong," she said clearly, her voice trembling only slightly. "I came here to buy a dress, that's all." Margaret scoffed loudly, as though the words themselves were laughable. She leaned toward Sophie again, seizing control of the moment. "If you won't protect the integrity of this store, then I will. You should check her bag." Amira's heart skipped. The room grew louder with whispers. Sophie froze, her clipboard clutched tight to her chest. I don't know if that's—" she stammered. Margaret cut her off sharply. "Of course you should. If she has nothing to hide, there's nothing to fear. Unless—" She let the word dangle, poisonous and heavy. Amira felt her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to refuse, to demand dignity, but she also knew what would happen if she resisted. The accusations would multiply, and the whispers would twist into assumptions of guilt. So she inhaled, lifted her chin, and said quietly, "Fine, check it." Gasps flickered through the boutique as she handed over her small leather bag, her hand steady though her insides churned with humiliation. Sophie hesitated, then slowly unzipped it, her movements awkward under the scrutiny of the crowd. Lip gloss, wallet, phone, a receipt from the cafe down the street. Nothing more. Sophie looked up, her voice small. "There's nothing here." For a second, relief washed over Amira, but before she could reclaim her dignity, Margaret snapped, "Check again." Her voice cracked like a whip across the boutique. She must have hidden it somewhere else. People like her always know tricks. The phrase "people like her" hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. This time, everyone heard it. A ripple of discomfort passed through the customers, some shifting uncomfortably, some shaking their heads. Amira felt tears sting at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She took her bag back, clutched it against her side, and spoke with a voice steady and fierce. "I don't need to prove myself to you," she said, her words cutting like glass. "And if you think humiliation makes me small, you're wrong. It only shows who you really are." The boutique froze in silence. Even Margaret faltered for a beat, her lips twitching as if searching for her next weapon. And then, with a smug smile, she turned to Sophie again. "Get her out of here. We don't need troublemakers ruining this place." Amira's chest tightened as Sophie hesitated. The young manager's lips parted, her eyes darting between Margaret and Amira, torn between the customer she feared losing and the dignity she knew she was betraying. Finally, in a soft voice almost swallowed by the silence, Sophie said, "I think it's best if you leave." The words sliced deeper than Margaret's accusations. Amira blinked, disbelief and hurt mixing in her chest. "You're asking me to leave," she whispered. Sophie looked away. "We just don't want any more disruption." Margaret's smile widened triumphantly. "Exactly." Amira's voice grew louder, firmer, echoing across the boutique. "You're asking me to leave even though I've done nothing wrong, even though the only thing I did was walk into a store to buy a dress." Her words rang out, and for the first time, heads began to nod, not in Margaret's favor, but in recognition of the injustice unfolding before their eyes. The confrontation had reached its first true clash, and though Amira stood alone in that moment, her presence filled the room. The boutique no longer felt like a sanctuary of silk and perfume. It had become a stage, every pair of eyes fixed on Amira as though she were a character in a play she hadn't agreed to perform. She stood in the emerald green gown, her bag clutched against her side, the sting of Sophie's words still echoing in her ears. She had been asked to leave, not because of anything she had done, but because a woman with pearls and entitlement demanded it. Margaret thrived in the silence that followed. She straightened her shoulders, savoring her moment of control, and stepped closer to Amira as though she were the one in charge. "I told you," she said in a voice that carried across the room. "Girls like her come in here to make a scene, not to shop. They take, and we're supposed to just look the other way." The venom in her words was undeniable now. Customers shifted uneasily, some frowning, others folding their arms across their chests. A young man near the watch display muttered, "That's not right," but his voice was swallowed by the heavy hush. Amira drew in a deep breath. Her pulse hammered, but she refused to bow her head. "I haven't stolen anything," she said, her voice steady, her tone measured, "and you know that." Margaret tilted her chin, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Do I?" She turned dramatically toward Sophie, gesturing with one manicured hand. "She's hiding something. I saw her slip something into her bag. Didn't you see?" Sophie froze. Her eyes widened as if caught in a trap. She hadn't seen anything, of course, but the accusation hung in the air like smoke, suffocating her judgment. She stammered, I didn't." "Then look again," Margaret snapped. "Open the bag. Check properly this time." Amira's chest tightened. The humiliation already felt unbearable, but now Margaret was doubling down, twisting Sophie's uncertainty into fuel for her prejudice. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity overwhelming their discomfort. Amira held her bag tighter. "You already checked," she said to Sophie, her voice quiet but firm. "There's nothing there, because I haven't done anything wrong." Margaret's laugh cut through the room like glass breaking. Of course she'd say that. They always do. For the first time, Amira felt her composure falter. Her throat tightened, and her eyes stung, but she steadied herself with a deep breath. She wouldn't let Margaret see her break. Not here. Not in front of people who needed to see strength instead of defeat. "If you have proof," Amira said, her voice rising just enough to command attention, "then show it. If not, stop harassing me." The words echoed louder than she expected, reverberating off the boutique's walls. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few nodded subtly, emboldened by her courage, though none stepped forward. Margaret's face flushed with indignation. "You think you can talk to me that way?" she hissed. "In this store. Do you know who I am?" Amira's jaw set. She wanted to say she didn't care, that no one's name or wealth should buy them the right to treat others with cruelty. But before she could answer, Margaret turned once more to Sophie, pressing the advantage. "If you don't act now, this whole store will look like it tolerates thieves. Do you really want that reputation?" The pressure weighed heavily on Sophie's shoulders. She glanced at the clipboard in her hands, then at Margaret's piercing gaze, then at Amira, who stood tall but visibly trembling. Sophie's conscience screamed at her, but fear silenced it. I think maybe we should check one more time," she whispered, her voice betraying her uncertainty. Gasps rippled across the boutique. The customers who had been uneasy now exchanged looks of disbelief. They had all seen the bag checked already. There was nothing there. This wasn't about suspicion anymore, it was about power. Amira's breath caught. She felt heat rise to her cheeks. Her dignity was being stripped layer by layer, not because of evidence, but because of the color of her skin and the confidence she carried. She wanted to scream, but instead she spoke slowly, each word chosen with precision. "Enough," she said. "You've looked once. You've found nothing. If you choose to believe lies, that's on you." but I will not stand here and let you strip away my self-respect." Her words rang clear, cutting through the suffocating tension. For the first time, several customers nodded openly, some even whispering to each other in disapproval of Margaret's persistence. But Margaret wasn't done. She jabbed a finger toward Amira, her voice rising with every syllable. "You see, defensive. That's how you know she's guilty. They always try to play the victim." The poison in her words filled the boutique. Amira stood her ground, though her hands clenched at her sides. Her body trembled, not with fear, but with the sheer effort of containing the storm inside her. "This isn't defensiveness," she said, her voice strong, carrying across the boutique. "This is self-respect. There's a difference." The room fell into stunned silence. The truth in her words hung heavy, undeniable. Even Sophie's eyes flickered with shame, as though she finally recognized her own complicity. Still, Margaret smirked, unwilling to surrender. "If she has nothing to hide," she said loudly, "then why not let us check again? Unless she knows what we'll find." Amira exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. She looked around the boutique, at the silent witnesses who avoided her eyes, at the manager who had failed her, and at the woman who was determined to break her spirit. And then she understood this was no longer just about a dress. It was about dignity, about standing firm when the world demanded she shrink. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and answered with clarity that left no room for doubt. "You've already decided who I am before I even walked in here. You see what you want to see, but I will not let your prejudice define me." For the first time, Margaret faltered. The smugness flickered, her confidence cracking under the weight of Amira's calm defiance. The customers shifted again, this time with visible unease at Margaret's persistence. A woman near the accessories counter whispered, "She's right," loud enough for others to hear. Another nodded in agreement. Margaret's control was slipping, and she knew it. But instead of backing down, she doubled her fury, pointing again at Amira and raising her voice. "Get her out, right now, before she takes something and ruins this store's reputation." Sophie stood frozen, caught in the crossfire of fear and conscience, her knuckles white around the clipboard. And Amira, standing tall in the emerald gown, knew this battle was far from over. The air in Maison Estelle had grown heavy, as though every molecule was charged with unease. The store, once a gallery of elegance, felt like a courtroom with Amira standing on trial for simply existing. She could feel her knees trembling beneath the emerald green gown, but she rooted her heels into the polished marble floor, refusing to move an inch. Margaret Whitmore stood opposite her like a prosecutor who needed no evidence, only entitlement. Her pearl necklace gleamed under the boutique lights as she gestured dramatically toward Amira. "Look at her," she barked. "She won't even open her bag again. That tells you everything." Amira pressed her lips together, summoning every ounce of restraint she had left. "It tells you nothing," she replied softly, "except that I won't allow myself to be humiliated twice." The words landed heavier than she anticipated. A ripple moved through the crowd of onlookers' customers who had abandoned their browsing to circle closer. Their whispers floated like static. "She's right. They already checked. Why are they pushing this? It's uncomfortable." But none stepped forward. None looked Margaret in the eye. The silence of the witnesses was louder than Margaret's accusations. Sophie Clark, the manager, shifted uneasily behind the counter. She held her clipboard like a shield, her gaze darting between Margaret and Amira. She wanted to intervene, but her fear of losing her job locked her voice in her throat. Margaret seized the silence, mistaking it for approval. "You see," she said loudly, "no one's defending her because we all know what's going on. People like her think rules don't apply." That phrase, "people like her," echoed through the boutique like a curse. Amira's chest tightened, but she refused to flinch. She wanted to believe someone would speak, that decency would outweigh fear. It was then that a sound cut through the tension, a small cough. Everyone turned. Near the handbags display stood an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, dressed in a tailored navy coat. She held a cane, but her presence was steady, commanding. "I think," the woman said, her voice crisp, "that we've all seen enough to know this is not about theft. This is about something uglier." The room froze. Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." "You heard me," the older woman replied. "That girl has done nothing wrong. I watched her the entire time. She admired a dress. She held it against herself. She looked like any young lady excited for an event. And you." She fixed her gaze on Margaret, chose to see a criminal instead of a customer. The silence cracked. Customers shifted, emboldened by the woman's courage. A man near the jewelry counter added, "She's right. I saw the manager check the bag. It was empty." Another voice chimed in from the back. "This is profiling. Plain and simple." Amira felt her throat tighten, not from fear this time, but from the rush of unexpected support. For a moment, she wasn't alone, but Margaret wasn't finished. Her face reddened, her lips curling into a sneer. "You people don't understand. Stores like this have to protect themselves. Thieves don't announce themselves. They blend in." The older woman raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly about this girl suggests she's a thief? Her skin color, her confidence, or the fact that she dared to walk into a boutique you think belongs only to people like you?" A collective gasp rose. Margaret recoiled as though struck. Amira stood frozen, overwhelmed by the weight of the woman's defense. She wanted to thank her, but her voice refused to emerge. Instead, Margaret whirled on Sophie. "Are you going to let customers insult me in your store? Are you going to side with them over me?" Sophie's hand shook around her clipboard. I just want to keep the peace," she stammered. "There is no peace when injustice is allowed," the silver-haired woman interjected. Her words rang like a bell. "Peace without dignity is just silence, and silence helps no one but the oppressor." Her statement landed with such force that several customers nodded aloud, their whispers swelling into agreement. For the first time, Margaret looked unsettled, though her pride refused to let her back down. She jabbed a finger at Amira. "This isn't over. She doesn't belong here." Amira finally found her voice. "I do belong here," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "Just like every person who walks through these doors, I came to buy a dress, not to defend my humanity." The words cut through the air, silencing even the whispers. And then, like a slow tide, the crowd began to shift. Customers turned away from Margaret, their gazes landing instead on Amira with quiet solidarity. Some nodded subtly, others simply met her eyes with recognition. They had become witnesses, not just bystanders. Sophie lowered her clipboard, her voice trembling but resolute. "She's right," she said, almost in a whisper, then louder. "She's right. This has gone too far." The declaration sent a jolt through the boutique. Margaret's face twisted with disbelief. "You dare defy me?" Sophie straightened, her fear yielding to something stronger. "I dare to do what's right." The boutique felt transformed in that moment, not by its marble floors or crystal chandeliers, but by the courage rising in ordinary people. The silent witnesses were no longer silent. And yet, even as the tide turned, Amira sensed the storm had not passed. Margaret's eyes burned with fury, her pride too great to let the matter end. She looked as though she were about to unleash her most venomous words yet. Amira braced herself, knowing the battle was not finished. The witnesses had begun to speak, but the weight of Margaret's wrath was still heavy, and the next blow would be the hardest yet. Amira's hands trembled, though she fought to steady them against the soft folds of the emerald gown. The boutique no longer felt like a place to shop. It had become a crucible. Margaret's rage was palpable, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Sophie's attempt at courage had shifted the energy. The older woman's intervention had cracked the silence, and yet Amira knew the storm was far from over. Margaret leaned closer, her perfume heavy, her tone dripping with venom. You think you've won because a few strangers mutter their little opinions. You're still nothing here. Nothing. The words hit like stones, but Amira refused to bend. She lifted her chin, her voice even. If I am nothing, then why are you so afraid of me standing here? The crowd stirred again, whispers rising like a low tide. Margaret recoiled slightly, caught off guard by the question, but she quickly masked it with a bitter laugh. Afraid, don't flatter yourself. Amira's pulse thundered in her ears. For the first time, she let her eyes sweep across the boutique, meeting the gazes of those who had been silent. Some looked away in shame, others nodded faintly, as though urging her on. Their presence gave her just enough courage to do what she had been holding back. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed in her hand, a lifeline she hadn't wanted to use, but now seemed necessary. She scrolled quickly, her thumb shaking, and pressed the number that lived at the top of her favorites list. The sound of ringing filled her ears. Margaret's laugh sharpened, cruel and mocking. What's this? Calling for backup who? Your boyfriend, maybe your mother. Do you think anyone's going to save you from this embarrassment? Amira didn't answer. She kept her gaze steady, her voice quiet but strong when the line clicked. The room stilled. The single word seemed to hang in the air. Margaret's smirk deepened. Oh, of course. Daddy to the rescue. How predictable. But Amira continued, her voice trembling just enough to betray the weight she carried. I need you to come. Something's happening at Maison Estelle. I need you here now. The crowd shifted. Everyone had heard the vulnerability in her tone, the plea hidden beneath her composure. Margaret folded her arms, rolling her eyes as though the very idea amused her. Pathetic. Running to your father because you can't stand on your own. Amira ended the call, sliding her phone back into her pocket. She drew a breath, grounding herself. I've stood on my own this entire time, she said softly. But sometimes, strength means knowing when to call for help. Her words cut sharper than any shout. Even Sophie blinked, startled by the quiet wisdom in them. Margaret's scoff broke the silence. Please, whoever your father is, I doubt he matters here. This is my world, my store. People like you don't belong in it. The phrase was poison, and the crowd knew it. Whispers rose again, louder this time, some murmuring disapproval. The older woman with the cane shook her head, her voice carrying clearly, You've already humiliated yourself more than you realize. But Margaret pressed on, unwilling to yield. Let him come, she said mockingly. I'll tell him myself. Maybe he'll thank me for teaching his daughter a lesson in reality. Amira said nothing. She clasped her hands together, holding them still against the tremor in her fingers. Her heart raced, not from fear anymore, but from anticipation. She knew what her father's arrival would mean. She knew the weight he carried, not just as her parent, but as a man whose presence changed rooms. Minutes stretched, thick with tension. Customers whispered. Sophie fidgeted. Margaret paced like a predator circling its prey. And then, faint at first, came the sound that shifted everything, the low rumble of footsteps, firm and deliberate, approaching from the boutique's glass doors. The door swung open. Light from the street spilled into the boutique, and with it came a presence that silenced the room in an instant. David Johnson stepped inside. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his frame tall and commanding, his eyes steady, sharp, unyielding, swept across the boutique before they landed on his daughter. Amira exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Margaret blinked, momentarily thrown off, but quickly recovered. She strode forward, pearls jangling against her blouse. "You must be the father," she said smugly. "Good. You should know what your daughter has been up to. She's been disruptive, disrespectful, and frankly suspicious. I had no choice but to protect the integrity of this store." David's gaze shifted to Margaret, cool and unreadable. He didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but carried to every corner of the boutique. "Is that so?" Margaret nodded vigorously, mistaking his calm for agreement. "Yes. I've tried to be patient, but she refuses to cooperate. She wouldn't even let us check her bag again." "Doesn't that tell you something?" David's eyes flickered toward Sophie, who stood pale and trembling behind the counter. "Is this true?" he asked evenly. Sophie swallowed hard. We already checked her bag once." "There was nothing there," Margaret hissed. "Not properly. She could have hidden it." The older woman with the cane spoke again, her voice sharp. "I watched her. She did nothing wrong. You're making a fool of yourself." David's gaze returned to Margaret, and this time his voice hardened, though it never rose. "You accuse without evidence. You humiliate without cause, and you think that is integrity." Margaret's smirk faltered. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came. Amira stood taller now, drawing strength from her father's presence. She had fought to hold her dignity alone, but with him here, the weight on her shoulders eased. She wasn't invisible anymore. David turned toward Sophie again. "You are the manager?" "Yes," Sophie whispered. "Then you know better," he said quietly. "Or at least, you should." Her cheeks flushed crimson. Margaret broke in, desperate to reclaim control. "Who do you think you are, lecturing us in this store? You don't know what it's like to run a business like this. We can't afford to take chances with people who—" Her words trailed off as David reached into his jacket, withdrawing a slim leather folder. He opened it calmly, laying a card on the counter in front of Sophie. The logo gleamed under the lights, Heritage Lux Group. The name beneath it was unmistakable. David Johnson, Chief Executive Officer. Gasps rippled through the boutique. Sophie's eyes widened. The customers leaned closer. Even Margaret's face drained of color. David straightened, his voice steady and resolute. "This is not just a store you walked into, Ms. Whitmore. This is my store. Every inch of Maison Estelle belongs to the company I lead, and the young woman you've spent the last hour trying to humiliate." He turned, meeting Amira's eyes with pride. "Is my daughter." The words crashed through the boutique like thunder. Margaret's jaw fell open, her bravado shattering in an instant. Customers gasped aloud, whispers bursting into full voices. "She's the CEO's daughter. He owns this place. Unbelievable." Amira felt her chest rise, her breath releasing like a dam breaking. For the first time, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel alone. The storm had shifted, and the light was finally breaking through. For several long seconds, the boutique was nothing but silence, a silence so heavy it pressed against the glass walls and the polished marble floor. Margaret Whitmore's lips parted, her eyes darting from David's steady face to the card that bore his name, and then to Amira, who stood with her chin lifted and her shoulders squared. It was as though the world had shifted beneath her feet, and she was scrambling to find footing again. You're the CEO, Margaret stammered, her voice high, trembling, of Heritage Lux. David's gaze didn't waver. Yes. And this store is under my care, which means that every person who walks through these doors deserves respect and dignity. My daughter included. Gasps rose from the crowd. Customers whispered, their voices spilling over each other in disbelief. Some muttered about how they had suspected something. Others shook their heads in shame for staying silent too long. Sophie Clark, the manager, looked as though she wanted the ground to open and swallow her whole. Amira remained still, her eyes fixed on Margaret, her hands clenched loosely at her sides. She wasn't gloating, wasn't smirking, wasn't even smiling. Her expression was calm, steady, one of a girl who had already fought her battle before her father had arrived. Margaret tried to laugh, but the sound cracked. I didn't know. She never said who she was. How was I supposed to? David raised a hand, and the gesture silenced her. She shouldn't have to announce who she is to be treated fairly. My daughter's value does not come from my title. It comes from her humanity, something you failed to recognize. The older woman with the silver cane nodded firmly, her voice rising strong and clear. Amen to that. Her words carried, and others murmured their agreement. Margaret's face flushed, a deep shade of crimson. She shifted her gaze desperately toward Sophie. You told me to handle it. You let me think. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know who she was either, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I should have known better. I should have stood up for her. David's gaze softened slightly but held its steel. Yes, you should have, because your job is not to serve the whims of one customer, but to uphold the integrity of this store for all customers. The crowd was no longer silent. People spoke openly now, their disapproval of Margaret unmistakable. Words like disgusting, shameful, and unbelievable carried from corner to corner. A man near the back shook his head. I'll never forget the way she talked to that girl, he muttered to his wife. Margaret's hands fluttered at her pearls. Her voice rose, shrill. I only wanted to protect the store's reputation. David's eyes narrowed, his tone calm but cutting. By accusing a young woman without evidence, by humiliating her in front of strangers, you haven't protected anything. You've embarrassed yourself, and you've stained the very reputation you claim to value. The words landed like a hammer. Margaret opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. Amira finally spoke, her voice steady. You judged me before you even knew me. You didn't care what was true, you just saw what you wanted to see. The silver-haired woman tapped her cane against the floor, nodding in agreement. That's exactly it. People like her think they own the air we breathe. Margaret looked around, searching for allies, but none remained. The customers' eyes were hard. Their judgment now turned against her. Even Sophie, pale and shaken, could not meet her gaze. David took a step closer to Margaret, his presence towering but never raised in volume. You are no longer welcome here, not in this store, not in any store I own. My employees will make sure your account is closed, your access revoked. You will not harass another customer under the banner of Heritage Lux again. The crowd reacted with audible gasps. Margaret staggered back, her hand clutching her pearls as if they could protect her from the weight of his words. You can't do that, she sputtered. David's voice was calm, almost gentle, but final. I already have. The bodyguard at the door shifted, a silent presence that underscored the command. Margaret's breath hitched, her face draining of its earlier bravado. For the first time that afternoon, she looked small, exposed. "You're making a mistake," she whispered hoarsely. "I'm a loyal customer. I've spent thousands here. Money does not buy dignity." David replied, "Not here. Not ever." The room erupted not with chaos, but with the release of tension that had been building for nearly an hour. Some customers clapped softly, others nodded with approval. The silver-haired woman smiled at Amira, her eyes warm. Margaret, realizing there was no way back, turned sharply on her heel. Her heels clacked against the marble floor, echoing through the boutique as she stormed toward the exit. But the sound was hollow now, stripped of the power it once carried. She paused at the door, glancing back one last time, her face twisted with rage and humiliation. Her eyes met Amira's, but the younger girl did not flinch. She simply stood tall beside her father, her expression calm and unbroken. That silent strength was the final blow. Margaret pushed through the glass doors and disappeared into the bright Chicago afternoon. For a moment, the room remained still, as though absorbing what had just happened. Then the whispers began again, but this time they carried admiration, not doubt. Amira breathed deeply, the weight in her chest finally lifting. She glanced at her father, who gave her a small nod of pride. "You did well," he said quietly, just for her. "You stood tall." Amira's lips curved into a faint smile. "I tried." David placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "That's all you ever have to do." The boutique was no longer hostile. Customers approached, some to apologize for their silence, others to thank Amira for her courage. The silver-haired woman leaned on her cane, her eyes sparkling. "You've got more strength than most grown men I've known," she said warmly. Amira smiled, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you." Sophie approached next, her face streaked with shame. She clasped her hands together, unable to meet David's gaze. "Mr. Johnson, I don't know what to say. I failed. I should have stopped it sooner." David regarded her for a long moment. His voice was calm but unyielding. "Yes, you should have. And I expect better from my managers. Integrity is not optional. It is the foundation of everything we stand for." Sophie's eyes brimmed with tears. "I understand. It won't happen again." David nodded once, then turned back to his daughter. His expression softened. "Let's go," he said gently. "You've been through enough today." Amira exhaled slowly, her smile faint but real. Together, they walked toward the back office, the crowd parting for them like a tide. Every eye followed, every heart still beating with the rhythm of what they had just witnessed. The air inside Maison Estelle felt different after Margaret Whitmore's exit. What had been charged with hostility and suspicion now hummed with the quiet relief of justice served. Yet under that relief lingered something else, reflection, even guilt. The customers who had stood frozen, who had whispered without intervening, now shifted uneasily, realizing they had been complicit in silence. David Johnson, still standing tall with Amira at his side, seemed to sense it. He didn't gloat, didn't bask in the stunned admiration. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, steady, and directed not only to Sophie, but to the entire room. This afternoon should never have happened. Not in this store. Not in any store. When prejudice walks through those doors, it is not just the responsibility of a manager to speak up. It is the responsibility of all of us. A hush settled again, but this time it was different. Customers bowed their heads, some nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of his words. The silver-haired woman tapped her cane against the floor. "That's right," she said. "Silence only helps the bully." Sophie Clark swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she answered. "You're right, Mr. Johnson. I let fear guide me, not fairness. I thought it would be easier to appease one voice rather than risk a scene. But in doing so, I became part of the injustice. David studied her for a long moment, his gaze stern but not cruel. Mistakes teach us if we're willing to learn. What matters now is how you choose to act moving forward. Amira, listening quietly, felt a swell of emotion. She had spent the last hour fighting to hold her ground, to preserve her dignity in the face of hostility. But hearing her father frame the issue not just as a personal wrong, but as a collective failing, struck deeper. She realized the battle wasn't just hers, it was about how society responded to moments like this. One of the younger customers, a man in his 20s with a baseball cap pulled low, raised his hand, hesitantly. "Mr. Johnson." I should have said something earlier. I saw what was happening, and I just froze. I didn't want to get involved, but now I realize that staying quiet makes me no better than her. David turned toward him, his voice gentler now. Acknowledging that is the first step. Courage doesn't always come in shouts. Sometimes it's in small actions, a word, a gesture, a refusal to stand by. Next time, use your voice. You'll be surprised how many will follow when one person dares to speak. The man nodded, visibly moved. The silver-haired woman smiled faintly at Amira. "You may be young, dear, but you taught us all something today. Strength isn't about raising your voice the loudest, it's about standing tall when someone tries to make you small." Amira's eyes softened. "I only did what anyone should do. No one deserves to be treated that way." Sophie, still pale, finally lifted her chin. "Mr. Johnson, I want to make this right. I'll file the incident report myself. I'll also organize training for the staff. Not because you're the CEO, but because today showed me how much we need it." David gave a single nod. "Good. That's a start. But don't do it for me. Do it for the next girl who walks in here, who may not have a father to arrive in time." The words sank deep, echoing through the room. Amira felt a lump in her throat. She had always admired her father's ability to turn personal pain into lessons that lifted others. Now, she saw it with fresh clarity. The tension that had gripped the boutique was dissolving, replaced by a solemn awareness. Customers who had been ready to slip quietly out now lingered, compelled to stay and witness. They wanted to carry this story with them, to remember it. David glanced at Amira. "You've been through enough today. Let's get you something to eat. You need to breathe." Amira nodded, though part of her didn't want to leave just yet. She turned toward the mirror where she had admired herself in the emerald gown. It still hung there, a silent reminder of the moment when joy had been stolen from her. She reached out, fingers brushing the fabric. David noticed. "Do you want it?" he asked softly. Amira hesitated. "I did, before everything. Then it's yours," he said simply. "Let this dress remind you not of the ugliness you faced, but of the strength you carried through it." Tears pricked her eyes, but she smiled. "Okay." Sophie stepped forward quickly. "Please, Mr. Johnson, Miss Johnson, let me have it packaged. It's the least I can do." David studied her for a moment before nodding. "Very well. But remember, gestures matter less than actions. Show me through change." Sophie swallowed hard. "I will." As Sophie disappeared into the back to prepare the dress, the boutique shifted once more. Customers approached Amira and David, offering quiet words of support. A mother with 2 children thanked Amira for showing her kids what it meant to be brave. A man shook David's hand firmly, saying, "We need more leaders like you." But the most touching moment came from the silver-haired woman. She reached out, her wrinkled hand trembling slightly, and placed it over Amira's. "Hold on to your grace, dear. It will carry you further than any cruelty could ever push you back." Amira squeezed her hand gently, whispering, "Thank you." The bodyguard, silent until now, stepped forward and leaned toward David. "Car's ready, sir." David gave a slight nod. He turned to Amira, his expression softening as only a father's could. "Let's go home." As they walked toward the exit, the boutique fell into a hush again. But this time, it wasn't silence born of fear or complicity. It was reverence. Every eye followed them, not because of David's title, but because of the truth they had witnessed, a truth about dignity, justice, and the courage to stand against prejudice. When the glass doors swung shut behind them, the boutique felt changed. The customers who remained would carry the weight of what they had seen, and Sophie Clark would spend many nights replaying her own choices, vowing never to repeat them. Outside, the Chicago afternoon stretched wide and bright. The city hummed with its usual rhythm, unaware that inside a single boutique, a battle had been fought and a lesson etched deep into the hearts of all who witnessed it. Amira drew a deep breath of the fresh air. For the first time that day, she felt light. Her father glanced at her with quiet pride. "You were remarkable," he said simply. And though the storm had passed, Amira knew this was only the beginning of her journey. There would be other battles, other Evelyns and Margarets in the world. But today had shown her something vital that dignity, once claimed, could never truly be taken away. The city lights had begun to glow against the fading Chicago sky when David Johnson and his daughter finally sat down at a quiet restaurant on the near north side. The place was discreet, tucked away from the bustle of Michigan Avenue, a sanctuary where father and daughter could decompress after the storm. The table was small, intimate, lit by the soft flicker of a single candle. Amira's emerald gown had been carefully wrapped and stowed in the back of the SUV, but its presence still lingered, a silent emblem of the afternoon. David studied his daughter across the table. The menu lay untouched between them, but food was the last thing on either of their minds. He leaned back, his voice calm but heavy with intent. "You handled yourself with strength today, Amira. More strength than many twice your age would have managed." Amira twirled the napkin in her hands, her eyes lowering for a moment. "I didn't feel strong. My hands were shaking the whole time. I kept thinking if I opened my mouth, my voice would break." David's expression softened. "Strength isn't the absence of fear, it's standing your ground despite it. Don't confuse the trembling with weakness. It means you cared enough about yourself to keep standing." She let his words settle, then lifted her eyes. "But it felt so unfair. Dad, I didn't do anything." She looked at me and just decided who I was, and everyone let her, even the manager. Even the people who knew it was wrong stayed quiet. David nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "That's the part that cuts deepest, doesn't it? Not just the attack, but the silence around it. It's the silence that makes you feel small, but silence can be broken. Today, you helped break it." Amira sighed. For a moment I thought maybe it was useless, that I should have just left and avoided the scene. But then, something in me refused. I didn't want her to win. David leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "And that refusal, that choice to stand your ground, is why you'll never truly lose. People like Margaret Whitmore thrive on intimidation. They rely on others shrinking away. But you didn't shrink. And because of that, everyone in that boutique will carry today with them." Their server approached quietly, setting down 2 glasses of water and stepping away without a word. The silence between father and daughter was filled not with tension, but with reflection. Amira sipped from her glass, then asked softly, "Dad, Do you ever get tired of it? Always having to prove yourself. Always being seen first for your skin instead of your work. David paused, the question sinking deep. His shoulders shifted slightly, as if carrying a weight invisible to anyone but him. Every day, he admitted. But I've learned something. Amira. Prejudice tries to strip dignity away, but it only succeeds if you let it. I can't control what others assume about me. What I can control is how I respond, how I lead, and how I make sure no one else feels smaller because of my silence. Amira studied him, her heart swelling with both admiration and sorrow. She had always seen her father as untouchable, a man who moved through boardrooms with unshakable confidence. To hear him admit his weariness made him human in a way that pierced her deeply. I don't want to live like that, she whispered, always bracing for someone to decide I don't belong. You won't, David said, his tone steady. Because you'll choose differently. You'll demand your place. And you'll surround yourself with people who see you for who you are. The world may try to tell you otherwise, but remember this, you belong everywhere your feet take you. Tears threatened at the corners of Amira's eyes, but she blinked them back, not wanting to dissolve into emotion. Instead, she straightened in her seat. When you walked in, everything shifted. She crumbled. They all did. Does power always work like that? David's lips curved in a faint smile. Power is a strange thing. Some people think it comes from titles, wealth, or fear. But true power, the kind that lasts, comes from principle. Today, my title revealed the hypocrisy of her words, but even without it, your dignity already spoke louder than her cruelty. Amira let the thought linger, her chest tightening with both pride and responsibility. I want to be like that, she said softly. You already are, David replied. Their food arrived: grilled salmon for David, roasted chicken for Amira, but for a while, neither touched it. They were too immersed in the quiet gravity of their conversation. Finally, Amira asked, Do you think Margaret will change after today? David considered the question carefully. Change is never guaranteed. Some people cling tighter to their prejudice when they're exposed. But sometimes, being confronted with truth, especially in public, plants a seed. Whether it grows or not depends on her. Amira frowned. I almost feel sorry for her. She looked so small when you banned her. David nodded. That's the paradox of prejudice. People act big to hide their smallness. What you saw wasn't strength, it was fear dressed up as entitlement. For the first time that day, Amira laughed softly, the sound easing some of the heaviness, fear in pearls. David chuckled quietly. Exactly. They began eating, the food grounding them back into ordinary life. Yet even as they chewed, the weight of the afternoon lingered. Amira felt both drained and renewed, as though she had been forged in a fire she hadn't expected to face. When the plates were cleared and dessert offered, David ordered a simple slice of chocolate cake, knowing his daughter's sweet tooth. When it arrived, Amira smiled faintly and picked up her fork. Today felt like the longest day of my life, she said between bites. David nodded, watching her with a father's quiet love. And yet, it's one you'll never forget. Days like this shape us. They remind us who we are and what we're capable of. They also remind us how much work remains to be done. Amira paused mid-bite, her eyes thoughtful. Work. The work of changing what people think is normal, David explained. The work of making sure dignity is the standard, not the exception. That's not just my job as a CEO, it's yours too, in whatever life you choose. She swallowed slowly, the weight of his words heavier than any forkful of cake. That sounds big. It is, David agreed, but you don't have to carry it all at once. You start small. One moment, one choice, one voice at a time, like you did today. The candle between them flickered, casting a glow across her young face. For the first time since the boutique, Amira felt her chest loosen. The storm had not broken her, it had reshaped her. As they stood to leave, David placed his hand gently on her back, guiding her out into the cool night air. Chicago's skyline glittered, vast and unbothered by the struggles of two people who had just endured something raw and real. But to Amira, the city looked different now. Every light seemed to remind her that resilience could outshine even the darkest corners of prejudice. She slipped her hand into her father's, squeezing gently. "Thank you for coming when I called." David squeezed back. "Always. That's what fathers are for." As they walked toward the waiting car, Amira felt lighter, not because the world had changed, but because she had. The next time someone tried to strip her dignity, she knew she would meet them with the same quiet strength her father had taught her. And deep down, she knew the battle was only beginning, but she was ready. The following evening arrived with a crisp chill in the Chicago air, the kind that made streetlights gleam against the pavement like scattered stars. Amira had dressed carefully for the Johnson Foundation Gala, her emerald gown restored to its rightful place on her shoulders. Now complemented by her grandmother's delicate bracelet, a symbol of resilience passed down through generations. David, in a classic black tuxedo, stood at her side as they entered the grand ballroom of the Lakeshore Hotel, where chandeliers spilled golden light across a sea of gowns and suits. This gala was not just another social event, it was the heartbeat of the foundation, funding scholarships, health clinics, and mentorship programs across the city. David had built the evening into a yearly ritual of hope, but tonight it carried more weight than usual. Whispers of what had happened at the boutique had already rippled through the city. Influential guests had read snippets on blogs, seen half-formed stories on social media. The tension of curiosity buzzed beneath the polished surface of the evening. As father and daughter walked in, conversations softened, eyes turned, and for a brief moment, the grand hall seemed to pivot around them. Amira felt the weight of those gazes, but refused to lower her chin. She walked with a poise she had not known she possessed, her father's steady presence grounding her steps. At the center of the ballroom, a string quartet played softly, their notes weaving a gentle fabric of calm. Waiters glided between tables with trays of champagne flutes. Guests mingled, exchanging pleasantries, their laughter rising like bubbles in the air. But beneath the elegance, Amira sensed the hush of anticipation, everyone waiting for David Johnson to speak. Before the speeches began, David guided his daughter toward a group of allies. Among them stood Senator Grace Thompson, a longtime supporter of the foundation, her sharp eyes immediately softening when she saw Amira. "So, this is the young woman of the hour," she said warmly, extending her hand. "I heard you had quite the encounter yesterday. You remind me of myself when I was your age, except I didn't have the courage to hold my ground the way you did." Amira blushed, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't feel courageous. I just didn't want to disappear." The senator squeezed her hand. "That, my dear, is courage." David watched the exchange with pride, but also with quiet calculation. He knew the gala was no longer simply about raising money, it was about reclaiming narrative. The boutique incident had shown the city something raw and real. Tonight, he needed to transform that rawness into vision, not just for his daughter, but for every child who might one day face a similar injustice. The evening unfolded gracefully, dinner served in silver dishes, donors thanked with sincerity, students sharing brief testimonies of how the foundation had shaped their lives. Yet the anticipation kept mounting, all leading to David's keynote address. When the time came, David took the stage with Amira seated proudly at the front. The microphone caught his first words, and the ballroom hushed. "Good evening, friends. Tonight, we gather as we always do to celebrate hope, to invest in futures, and to honor the dignity that every person deserves." His voice carried with measured strength, each syllable steady, deliberate. "But tonight, I must begin not with celebration, but with a truth my family lived just yesterday." A ripple of silence spread through the room. David paused, scanning the faces of the audience, each one now caught in the gravity of his words. "My daughter, Amira, walked into a store to buy a dress for this very evening. She was treated not as a customer, but as a suspect, not as a young woman with dreams, but as an intruder with no right to be there. She was humiliated until she stood her ground. And when I arrived, revealing who she was and who I was, the situation suddenly changed. But let me be clear, the dignity of my daughter should never have depended on my title, my wealth, or my presence." The words struck the audience with quiet force. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others leaned forward, nodding, recognizing the truth he unveiled. Yesterday was not simply about one store or one woman's prejudice. It was about the quiet assumptions that still exist in our society, the silent permissions that allow dignity to be questioned based on the color of one's skin. My daughter deserved respect, not because of who her father is, but because she is human. And so does every child, every family, every neighbor we pass on the street. Applause rose, slow at first, then swelling into something powerful. Amira felt her throat tighten, pride and vulnerability rushing together. David continued, his voice steady, his hand resting lightly on the podium. "The Johnson Foundation has always been about more than charity. It is about changing culture, about ensuring that our city, our schools, our businesses become places where dignity is non-negotiable, where silence in the face of prejudice is no longer tolerated. Tonight, I ask not just for your donations, but for your commitment to break silence, to stand up, to hold space for dignity wherever it is challenged." The room erupted in applause, some rising to their feet, their faces lit with conviction. Amira watched as her father's words wove a thread of urgency through the evening, binding strangers into allies, turning donors into advocates. But just as the applause softened, an unexpected moment unfolded. At the back of the ballroom, a woman stood. Her presence was unmistakable, Margaret Whitmore, her pearls gleaming under the chandeliers, her posture rigid. Gasps rippled through the room. No one had expected her to come. She raised her voice, trembling but audible. "Mr. Johnson, David, I came here tonight not to defend myself, but to admit what I did was wrong." Her eyes darted toward Amira, then back to the stage. "I judged your daughter because of my ignorance, my prejudice, and when you confronted me, I saw not just my cruelty, but my own fear. I cannot undo what I did, but I will not hide from it. I came tonight to apologize not just to your family, but to this community. And I pledge $500,000 to the Foundation's work, if you will accept it not as penance, but as a first step toward repair." The ballroom froze. Cameras clicked. Whispers surged. Amira's heart pounded, her emotions tangled between shock, suspicion, and a flicker of reluctant hope. David's gaze remained steady, weighing every word, every gesture. He spoke slowly, carefully. "Mrs. Whitmore, acknowledgement is the first step toward change. But know this, an apology without transformation is only words. If your pledge is more than charity, if it is a commitment to confront not only your own prejudice, but the structures that enable it, then we accept. But the real work will be yours to prove. The room erupted again, this time with a standing ovation, not just for David, but for the possibility of redemption. Amira sat frozen, trying to absorb the twist she had never expected. As the gala drew to a close, she found herself pulled into countless conversations, strangers offering words of admiration, encouragement, even tears. Yet in the quiet corner of her heart, she wrestled with the complicated truth: people can change, but trust must be earned. When the last guest departed and the chandeliers dimmed, Amira and her father walked out into the night once more. The city seemed alive with possibility, humming with a new current of hope. Amira knew her journey was only beginning, but tonight she felt something she hadn't the day before. She felt powerful, not because of her father's name, but because she had stood in the fire and emerged with her dignity intact. Chicago woke the next morning to headlines that seemed to pulse from every newsstand. Radio broadcast and phone screen: boutique scandal turns to gala redemption. CEO David Johnson calls for cultural shift. Socialite Margaret Whitmore pledges $500,000 after racism allegation. The city buzzed with conversation, some skeptical, some inspired, but no one indifferent. The story had spread beyond Chicago within hours, picked up by national outlets. Morning shows debated it, columnists weighed in, and hashtags surged: "Dignity first," "Stand with Amira," breaking silence. For Amira, the sudden glare of attention was overwhelming. She sat at the breakfast table scrolling through her phone, stunned by the flood of messages. Strangers wrote to say she had given them courage. Classmates sent texts of pride. Even teachers she barely spoke to before reached out. Yet alongside the support were the inevitable currents of cynicism comments accusing her of exaggeration, of playing the race card, or of hiding behind her father's power. Each cruel word stung, even as she told herself to brush them off. David watched her quietly, sipping his coffee. He knew this was part of the new reality. His daughter's dignity had become public property, her pain turned into a symbol. He hated the invasion, but understood its necessity. The city needed stories like hers to awaken conscience. Still, he resolved to shield her as much as possible. "Dad," Amira asked suddenly, her voice tentative, "what if people only listen because of who you are? What if they don't actually care? They just care about the headlines." David set his cup down, considering. "Symbols are imperfect. Amira, people project what they need onto them. But your story is not just mine to amplify, it's yours to shape. If the world is listening, then speak. Make them care. Not about me, but about the next girl who walks into a store with nothing but her courage." The day pressed on with meetings, calls, and strategy sessions. At the foundation office, David convened his board. The atmosphere was charged, donors eager to seize the momentum, staff buzzing with purpose. David outlined his plan: expand the scholarship program, launch workshops on workplace dignity, and create a new initiative called Voices of Tomorrow, giving young people like Amira a platform to share their experiences. "We can't let this moment fade into gossip," David insisted. "We must turn it into a movement." The board responded with enthusiasm, approving immediate budget reallocations. Senator Thompson pledged to bring the story to the Senate floor, tying it to legislation on equal treatment in commerce. Other allies promised op-eds, town halls, and media appearances. The ripple had become a wave. Meanwhile, Margaret Whitmore's public apology continued to stir debate. Some praised her courage in admitting fault, others dismissed it as damage control. But her pledge of $500,000 was real, and reporters followed her every move to see if she would follow through. Margaret herself remained quiet after the gala, retreating from public events, leaving the city to wonder whether her transformation was sincere or staged. For Amira, the hardest part came later that week when she returned to school. Walking the halls felt like stepping onto a stage. Whispers followed her, some admiring, some mocking. A few students approached her directly, thanking her for standing tall, sharing their own experiences of being profiled. One girl confessed she'd been followed in a store last month, but was too afraid to say anything. Amira listened, realizing for the first time how much her story resonated. She wasn't just Amira Johnson anymore. She had become a voice others leaned on. And with that realization came both pride and pressure. That afternoon, her English teacher pulled her aside. "Amira, would you consider speaking at our school assembly next week? The students need to hear from you in your own words." The thought terrified her. Public speaking had never been her strength. Yet a spark inside whispered that perhaps this was exactly what she needed to do. She nodded hesitantly. "I'll try." At home, she shared the news with her father. He smiled gently. "Your first stage, bigger than the boutique, smaller than the world, but it will matter more than you think." As the week unfolded, the Johnson home became a hub of activity. Journalists requested interviews, community leaders sought meetings, even pastors called to invite David and Amira to speak at congregations. David declined most of the attention, insisting that Amira's voice should not be exploited, but he chose carefully which opportunities would help shape the larger movement. One evening, they sat together in the study as David helped her prepare for the assembly. He coached her not on polished rhetoric, but on authenticity. "Don't memorize lines," he advised. "Speak from the wound. Speak what you needed someone to tell you in that store." Amira practiced aloud, her voice trembling at first, then growing steadier. She spoke of the humiliation, the fear, the anger, but also the choice to stand her ground. She spoke of her father's reminder that dignity is not granted by others, it's claimed. As she practiced, David watched quietly, pride swelling in his chest. She was becoming more than a survivor. She was becoming a leader. On the morning of the assembly, Amira stood backstage in the school auditorium, her hands clammy, her stomach tight. She could hear the murmur of hundreds of students filing in. For a moment, she wished she could run. But then she remembered the boutique, the pearls, the way silence had hung heavy in the air until she broke it. She knew she couldn't step back now. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage, her emerald bracelet catching the light. She took a breath, looked out at the sea of faces, and began to speak. "Last week, I was told I didn't belong in a place I had every right to be. I was accused of something I didn't do, judged by how I looked, not who I was. For a moment, I almost left quietly. But then I realized if I left, I'd be agreeing with her. And I don't agree. I belong. We all belong." The auditorium fell silent, every ear tuned to her trembling but unwavering voice. "I'm not here to tell you I was brave. I was scared. I was angry. But sometimes courage is not about being fearless. It's about standing anyway. And I want you to know that if you ever feel small, if you're ever made to feel less than you are, you don't have to shrink. Your dignity is yours. No one can take it unless you hand it over." By the time she finished, the room was on its feet, applause thundering. Tears glistened in the eyes of teachers and students alike. Amira stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed, then smiled a real, unguarded smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Later, walking out of the auditorium, she felt lighter than she had in days. She knew the world would keep testing her. That prejudice wouldn't vanish overnight. But she also knew she had found her voice, and once found, it could not be silenced. At home that evening, David embraced her tightly. You see, Amira, you've already begun the work. You didn't just speak, you gave others permission to speak too. And somewhere in the city, as people replayed clips of her speech shared on social media, the ripples spread again, touching hearts far beyond the school walls. The boutique incident had started as a wound, but it was becoming something greater, a spark lighting fires of courage across the city. Winter loosened its grip on Chicago, the icy wind softening into a tentative spring. For Amira, the season seemed to mirror her own transformation. Where once she had walked through the city shrinking from notice, now she moved with her head high, carrying not arrogance but a quiet awareness of her worth. The incident at the boutique still lived in her memory, but it had shifted from a raw wound into a compass, pointing her toward purpose. The school assembly speech had gone viral, replayed on countless screens, praised by commentators and activists alike. Yet, for Amira, the most meaningful responses were the handwritten notes slipped into her locker stories from classmates who had endured silence in the face of prejudice, now daring to speak. She carried those notes in a shoebox beneath her bed, a treasure chest of courage that reminded her she was no longer just a girl caught in a humiliating scene. She was part of a chorus rising. David noticed the change in her. He saw it in the steadiness of her gaze, the conviction threading through her words. At foundation meetings, she now sat beside him, no longer as a silent observer, but as a voice offering perspective. When discussions turned to youth initiatives, she leaned forward, her ideas sharp, grounded in lived truth. The board listened. Donors leaned in. Slowly, Amira was stepping into a role she had not asked for, but one she seemed destined to hold. One evening, as they drove back from a community forum, David glanced at her in the passenger seat. "You know, Amira, the world doesn't just need CEOs and politicians. It needs witnesses, people who can testify to both the pain and the possibility. You've become one." Amira smiled faintly, watching the city lights flicker past. "Sometimes I wish I could just be normal, just a teenager." "You are," David said gently. "But you're also extraordinary. Both can be true." Their work deepened in the months that followed. The Voices of Tomorrow initiative launched officially, with young people from across Chicago gathering to share stories of bias, resilience, and belonging. Amira sat in those circles, listening as children younger than her spoke of being followed in stores, mocked in classrooms, overlooked in opportunities. Each story cracked her heart open further, but it also stitched her resolve tighter. She wasn't alone, and neither were they. Margaret Whitmore, to the surprise of many, followed through on her pledge. Not only did the funds arrive, but she also requested to volunteer quietly in one of the foundation's mentorship programs. At first, suspicion surrounded her motives. Some community members bristled, insisting her presence was a publicity stunt. But Amira, watching Margaret interact with students, saw something raw and awkwardness that wasn't arrogance, a clumsy attempt to undo harm. Whether redemption was truly hers remained uncertain, but Amira chose to leave space for possibility. By summer, the Johnson Foundation Gala had transformed from a singular event into a movement echoed in other cities. Partnerships sprouted in New York, Atlanta, Los Angeles. David testified before Congress about dignity in commerce, urging stronger protections against racial profiling in public businesses. Amira accompanied him, sitting just behind as he spoke, her bracelet catching the camera's light. A subtle reminder of the story that had started it all. The hearings were intense, with lawmakers divided. Some dismissed the push as unnecessary, arguing that things aren't that bad. Others leaned in, citing their own constituents' experiences. Amira watched it unfold, realizing how slow change could be when filtered through politics. Yet even in the slowness, She saw progress, the undeniable fact that dignity was now a subject in the nation's capital, debated under the dome where history was written. Outside of politics, Amira continued to grow. She began journaling regularly, her words raw and searching. She wrote not only about the boutique, but about the quiet microaggressions she noticed in daily life. The teacher who assumed she preferred certain books, the cashier who double-checked her bill, the stranger who clutched their bag tighter on the train. Writing gave her clarity, transforming pain into patterns, patterns into purpose. One late summer evening, she shared a few entries with her father. He read them slowly, his brow furrowed, then looked at her with quiet awe. These aren't just reflections, Amira, they're lessons. One day, the world will need to read them. Amira shook her head, embarrassed. They're just thoughts. David smiled knowingly. So were the speeches of leaders before they became history. The following autumn brought another twist. Amira was invited to deliver a keynote at a National Youth Summit in Washington, D.C. The thought terrified her all over again, thousands of faces, cameras, expectations. But she remembered the boutique, the gala, the assembly. Fear had always been there, but fear had never been final. She accepted. When she stepped onto that stage months later, wearing a simple navy dress and her grandmother's bracelet, she felt the weight of countless eyes. Yet as she began to speak, her voice carried steady. She told the story not of humiliation, but of dignity reclaimed, not of despair, but of hope. She spoke of silence broken, of courage found in trembling hands, of a father who reminded her that titles don't grant humanity. Humanity is already there. Her words rippled outward, caught in recordings, replayed in classrooms, echoed in living rooms. Teachers used her speech in lessons, parents shared it with children, activists cited it as proof that the younger generation was ready to lead. That night, back in her hotel room overlooking the Capitol dome, Amira stood at the window, her reflection mingling with the city lights. David joined her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You've come far, Amira," he said softly, "and this is only the beginning." Amira looked out at the horizon, her heart steady. She thought of the boutique, of the pearls, of the silence that had once threatened to swallow her. Now, she thought of the shoebox filled with stories, the students who had stood taller because she had spoken, the countless ripples turning into waves. For the first time, she didn't just see herself as the girl in the store. She saw herself as part of something larger, a movement not confined to one incident, one gala, one city, a movement toward dignity that could outlast prejudice, outshine fear, and outlive them all. She turned to her father, her eyes bright with conviction. "I'm ready." And together, they stood facing the horizon, not as a man and his daughter caught in scandal, but as witnesses to a truth the world could no longer ignore. Dignity was not negotiable. This story reminds us of a truth many prefer to ignore. Prejudice often hides in everyday places, stores, schools, offices. It isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it comes in the form of suspicion, silence, or misplaced authority. Yet what defines us is not the injustice we face, but how we choose to respond. Amira stood her ground with dignity, even when falsely accused. Her father reminded everyone that respect should never depend on status, wealth, or appearance. Together, they showed that courage doesn't always mean shouting louder. It often means speaking calmly when the world expects you to break. For older audiences, the lesson is especially clear. We are all witnesses in moments of injustice. Choosing silence may feel safe, but it allows harm to continue. Speaking up, even with a few words, can shift the balance and offer protection to someone more vulnerable. In our lives, whether at the grocery store, the doctor's office, or a family gathering, we will see unfairness. The question is, will we look away? or will we stand for dignity? The story reminds us that justice is not abstract. It lives in the small choices we make every day. Thank you so much for watching and for sharing this journey with us. Stories like these matter because they reflect the world we live in and the world we want to create. If this touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Together, we can keep these conversations alive.